March 7, 1945. The sky above Remagen hung heavy with smoke, tinged by the faint orange of a dying sun. The Rhine flowed dark and restless beneath the arches of the Ludendorff Bridge, a steel giant already scarred by bomb craters and desperate repairs. Somewhere upstream, distant artillery thundered, shaking the earth beneath trembling boots. On the German side, officers gathered on the riverbank, faces pale, eyes fixed on the bridge that had become a lifeline and a curse. Orders shouted, radios crackling, and the cries of exhausted soldiers blended with the relentless roar of American tanks approaching. Then, through the chaos, a small group of U.S. soldiers reached the northern end of the bridge. One raised the stars and stripes, a fluttering banner against the smoke, against the ruins. For the German officers watching, a single thought hardened in their minds: it's all over now. In that moment, the war on the Western Front shifted irreversibly. What happened next would not only determine the fate of Remagen, but signal the approaching end of Nazi Germany. By early 1945, the Third Reich was teetering on the edge of collapse. On the Western Front, Allied forces had crossed France and Belgium with relentless momentum. American, British, and Canadian armies pressed toward Germany, having liberated Paris months earlier and broken through the Siegfried Line's fragmented defenses. For German commanders, the Rhine River had become the final natural barrier, a last line of hope to slow the inexorable advance. The Rhine was more than geography. It was a psychological symbol. Cities like Cologne, Düsseldorf, and Bonn were vital industrial and transportation hubs. If the Allies crossed, German forces would be exposed and the heartland of the Reich would lie vulnerable to invasion. Adolf Hitler's orders were clear: defend the river at all costs. Bridges were to be destroyed to deny passage. Every road and crossing became a potential trap. Yet after years of war, German forces were overstretched, supplies dwindling and morale fractured. Among the Allies, the capture of intact bridges across the Rhine became a strategic obsession. American planners recognized that a sudden, unopposed crossing could allow armored divisions to penetrate deep into Germany, bypassing the heavily fortified Siegfried Line. Intelligence reports suggested that German engineers were struggling to maintain or demolish key bridges under constant bombardment. For the Americans, this presented both an opportunity and a race against time. Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, spanning the Rhine near the town of Remagen, was particularly significant. Constructed during World War I and repaired continuously since, it remained one of the few bridges still standing. German engineers had rigged it with explosives ready to demolish it if an enemy advance threatened. Yet the rapid American advance left little time for precise execution. Units under Oberstleutnant Hans Scheller and other local commanders were scrambling to reinforce defenses and prepare for a last-ditch demolition. Aware that failure would be catastrophic, the atmosphere on the German side was tense. Radio intercepts confirmed that U.S. troops were approaching rapidly. Orders came in fragmented waves, often contradicting one another, leaving officers uncertain whether to retreat, hold, or risk lives in a desperate defense. Every bridge, every crossing, every piece of infrastructure had become a focal point in the final chapter of the Western campaign. Soldiers on both sides sensed the gravity of the coming days. A single bridge could determine the speed of Germany's collapse. As the sun rose on March 7, 1945, the stage was set. Remagen, a small town on the west bank of the Rhine, was about to become the focal point of history. The forces gathering here would decide whether the Allies could surge into Germany unopposed, or whether the Rhine would finally hold its line. The tension, the fear, and the anticipation were palpable. Every decision, every footstep, every glance at the looming arches of the Ludendorff Bridge carried weight beyond the immediate moment. And in the shadows, German officers were beginning to feel the first stirrings of a truth they had long avoided acknowledging. In early March 1945, American forces from the U.S. First Army were pressing eastward with urgency. After breaching the Siegfried Line in late February, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' units moved relentlessly toward the Rhine. Intelligence had pinpointed the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen as one of the few remaining intact crossings. Its capture promised a direct route into the heart of Germany, and the Allies were determined to seize it before the Germans could destroy it. On the German side, preparations were frantic. Oberstleutnant Hans Scheller, commanding officer at Remagen, faced a nearly impossible situation. Communications were erratic, reinforcements scarce, and morale at a historic low. Engineers worked feverishly, attempting to lay explosives along the bridge's steel girders. Every calculation mattered. Too early and the Allies would seize the structure anyway. Too late and German troops could be trapped on the far side. Meanwhile, small units patrolled the approaches, manning anti-tank guns and artillery positions along the western bank of the Rhine, ready to halt any American advance. The town itself bore the scars of war. Civilians had evacuated or were huddled in cellars. Windows shattered from earlier artillery fire. Smoke drifted from collapsed buildings, mixing with the river's mist. Soldiers moved cautiously along streets strewn with rubble, aware that the coming clash could leave Remagen in ruins. The air was thick with tension, a combination of fear, urgency, and the bitter resignation of men who knew the strategic importance of every step they took. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance units moved forward under cover of early morning fog. Tank platoons rumbled through small roads, infantry followed, and engineers readied portable bridges, anticipating obstacles but hoping for speed. Every intelligence report indicated that German demolitions were incomplete or rushed, presenting a rare opportunity to capture a fully intact bridge. For the Americans, speed and precision were paramount. Hesitation could cost them the advantage. By the afternoon of March 7th, the 1st American Infantry reached the outskirts of Remagen. Artillery fire had already begun to crack the streets, softening positions and testing German defenses. Observers on the German side could see the enemy forming lines, approaching systematically, coordinating assaults with a clarity that contrasted sharply with their own fragmented command. The weight of the situation was clear. Failure to hold the bridge or destroy it in time could open the Rhine to enemy tanks within hours. As dusk approached, both sides understood that the next hours would be decisive. German officers, weighing desperate orders and fractured defenses, could not yet fully grasp how close their collapse truly was. Across the river, American soldiers pressed forward, disciplined and methodical, aware that capturing the Ludendorff Bridge intact could change the course of the war in Germany. The stage was set for an encounter that would not only test strategy and engineering but also define the psychological state of the German command. And in this charged, fragile moment, the first glimmers of the inevitability that would soon strike German officers were beginning to emerge. Human. For the German officers at Remagen, the hours before the American arrival were marked by tension, indecision, and a creeping sense of futility. Oberstleutnant Hans Scheller paced the command post, reports clutched in hand, radios crackling with fragmented messages from scattered units. Every decision seemed both critical and impossible. The bridge, their last tangible defensive asset on the western bank, had become a symbol of both hope and dread. Soldiers, many of them young and exhausted from months of retreat, moved through the streets with a mixture of discipline and hesitation. Some obeyed orders automatically, their faces pale, hands trembling as they checked weapons. Others whispered doubts in corners, aware that even if they held the bridge, the overwhelming strength of the American advance would soon render their efforts meaningless. Human psychology collided with strategy. Fear, resignation, and stubborn duty intertwined on every street and riverbank. Tactically, the German defensive plan relied on explosives rigged along the Ludendorff Bridge's steel arches, anti-tank guns positioned to sweep the approaches, and machine gun nests covering the western bank. Yet timing was everything. Miscalculate and the bridge could be destroyed before it served its purpose. Delay and it could fall intact to the Americans. Officers debated furiously. Scheller and his peers understood that the bridge's fate would dictate the speed and success of the American advance. Every misstep carried immediate and catastrophic consequences. Meanwhile, German engineers worked feverishly under constant threat from aerial reconnaissance. Every detonation charge had to be placed with precision, yet exhaustion and dwindling supplies made their task nearly impossible. Each rung, girder, and span carried the weight of an entire defensive strategy, while men moved quietly, acutely aware that one mistake could cost lives on both sides. Across the river, the psychological effect of the Americans' approach was equally potent. German troops could see armored vehicles in the distance, the disciplined movement of infantry, and the methodical pace of engineers. For officers, this visual confirmation of enemy capability was terrifying. The combination of relentless pressure, communication breakdowns, and a looming bridge crossing created a moral and tactical crisis. Every glance at the Rhine, every sound of distant artillery deepened the human tension. Soldiers' fatigue was matched by officers' anxiety. Orders to destroy the bridge had been delayed, partially out of hope, partially out of disbelief. And in those long, heavy hours, German officers began to sense a truth they had long avoided. The bridge might not be theirs to control for much longer. As the Americans drew closer, the line between tactical calculation and human fear blurred. Decisions were no longer purely strategic. They were intensely personal, tied to survival, duty, and the desperate hope that some measure of control could be maintained. In this fragile intersection of human endurance and military necessity, the stage was set for the moment that would later echo across history. Technological leadership. While German officers wrestled with indecision, American commanders executed a plan born of precision, discipline, and engineering ingenuity. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges had recognized the value of intact Rhine bridges months before, but it was Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engel and the men of the 9th Armored Division who would turn opportunity into reality. Intelligence reports had identified Ludendorff Bridge as a rare functioning crossing, a potential golden route into Germany. Leadership now required swift action. The Americans understood that speed, coordination, and engineering skill would decide success. Combat engineers were assigned the delicate task of clearing obstacles and reinforcing the bridge against partial demolition. Portable bridging equipment, anti-tank measures, and infantry support were synchronized to reduce delay and exposure. Every movement was choreographed with the knowledge that German defenders were watching, calculating, and waiting to act. Technological innovation played a pivotal role. Engineers carried shaped charges, demolition-resistant materials, and improvised tools to repair or stabilize sections of the bridge. Communication lines linked infantry, armor, and engineers, allowing immediate responses to unforeseen obstacles. The Americans approached with a methodical, almost mechanical rhythm, advancing cautiously but decisively, ensuring that every asset could be leveraged at the precise moment it was needed. Leadership under pressure was equally critical. Commanders on the ground, including Colonel Venard Wilson and Lieutenant Colonel William Robertson, made split-second decisions that balanced aggression with caution. They understood that hesitation could allow German demolition teams to finish their work, while reckless speed could expose soldiers to heavy fire. Coordination, confidence, and trust in subordinates' judgment were essential in this high-stakes environment. The technological advantage of the Americans extended beyond machinery. Reconnaissance reports, intercepted communications, and careful study of German defensive layouts provided situational awareness that German officers lacked. This intelligence allowed precise deployment of tanks, artillery, and infantry units, maximizing impact while minimizing risk. Each decision, where to place a squad, which girder to stabilize, when to advance, was a calculated blend of human insight and technological capability. By mid-afternoon, the Americans were poised at the western bank, ready to seize the bridge. Every movement reflected training, preparation, and the careful exploitation of German hesitation. While the German command wrestled with fragmented communications and emotional strain, American leaders executed an intricate plan with clarity and precision. In this intersection of technology and leadership, the Ludendorff Bridge was transformed from a symbol of German defense into a potential conduit for Allied advance. The stage was set. Both human psychology and technological mastery would collide in the next hours. Officers and soldiers on either side of the Rhine were unaware that the moment of decisive action, the crossing that would shock German command, was only minutes away. March 7, 1945, mid-afternoon, the 1st American Infantry reached the western edge of Remagen, moving cautiously through streets lined with rubble and shadowed by smoke. Tanks rumbled behind them, their engines echoing against the river's surface. Combat engineers carried equipment to stabilize sections of the bridge, eyes fixed on steel girders that trembled under previous bombardments. German defenders were tense but uncoordinated. Orders to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge had been delayed, buried under conflicting commands and the weight of confusion. Explosives had been partially wired. Some charges were positioned incorrectly, others never connected. Oberstleutnant Hans Scheller moved frantically among his officers, issuing instructions that often arrived too late. Morale was brittle, and the human cost of hesitation was becoming clear. As the Americans advanced onto the bridge, a deadly silence hung in the air. Small arms fire erupted from makeshift positions along the western bank, met by precise return fire from American squads. Tanks rumbled onto the approaches, their tracks crushing debris while engineers worked to bypass obstacles. The river itself seemed to pulse with tension, reflecting the sky and the looming arches of the Ludendorff Bridge like a mirror of the struggle above. Minutes stretched like hours. German officers watched helplessly as U.S. soldiers climbed the bridge, carefully navigating weakened steel sections. Every step was calculated, every decision a test of courage and coordination. American forces were disciplined, moving as one unit, exploiting every flaw in the German defense. The contrast between their methodical advance and the German hesitation was stark, a visual testament to the difference in preparation and morale. By late afternoon, the first Americans reached the bridge's northern end, just meters from the eastern bank. German officers realized the gravity of the situation. The bridge might not be destroyed in time. Tension hardened into panic, and whispers of inevitability passed among the officers. The moment of truth was upon them, and the die was about to be cast. By late afternoon on March 7th, American forces had secured more than half of the Ludendorff Bridge. Engineers worked feverishly to bypass remaining obstacles while infantry squads pushed forward under sporadic machine gun fire. Every meter of steel crossed brought them closer to the eastern bank, and closer to a moment that would echo through history. On the German side, officers watched in growing horror. Oberstleutnant Scheller and his colleagues realized that the demolition charges had failed. Wires had snapped, fuses misfired, and the explosives placed along the arches were incomplete. Panic rippled through the defensive ranks. Some soldiers retreated. Others hesitated, unsure whether to obey the desperate last-minute orders to detonate what remained. The bridge, the last line between the Rhine and the advancing Allies, remained stubbornly intact. At 3:30 p.m., the first Americans reached the eastern end of the bridge. A young soldier, rifle slung, climbed the steel girders and planted a small U.S. flag atop the northern span. It fluttered against smoke, steel, and river mist, an unmistakable symbol of victory. Across the river, German officers froze, eyes wide, voices caught in throats. A stunned silence filled the air, broken only by distant artillery and the soft roar of the river. "It's all over now," one officer muttered, his words swallowed by the chaos around him. Others nodded silently, the weight of inevitability pressing down. For hours they had clung to hope, orchestrating defenses, calculating demolitions, clinging to the last strands of control. Now those calculations were meaningless. The Americans had crossed. The Rhine was open. Within minutes, American troops poured onto the eastern bank, quickly securing the surrounding terrain. German counterattacks were disorganized, scattered, and ineffective. The psychological blow to the defenders was immediate. The bridge, once a symbol of hope and a defensive lifeline, had become a conduit for the enemy. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge did more than facilitate the crossing of the Rhine. It shattered the illusion of German control. Commanders who had believed in their ability to hold the line faced the stark reality. The Western Front was collapsing, and the end of the Third Reich was accelerating with every passing hour. The scene at Remagen would linger in history, not just for the strategic victory, but for the human emotions etched into that moment: despair, disbelief, and the unmistakable acknowledgement that a turning point had arrived. The morning after March 7, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge stood intact, a testament to both American precision and German miscalculation. Across the Rhine, U.S. soldiers consolidated their hold, quickly establishing defensive positions on the eastern bank. Tanks, artillery, and infantry units poured through, transforming a single crossing into a broad avenue for armored divisions. The bridge had become more than steel and concrete. It was now a symbol of momentum, signaling that the Allies could advance deep into Germany with unprecedented speed. On the German side, the impact was immediate and crushing. Officers who had spent the previous hours issuing frantic orders now faced the reality of failure. Entire units were demoralized, many retreating in disarray toward the west, while others remained frozen on the riverbank. unsure whether to regroup or surrender. The loss of the bridge rendered months of strategic planning null. Commanders had expected to slow the Allied advance for weeks, perhaps months. Instead, the Rhine was suddenly open, and the momentum of the Western Front swung decisively in favor of the Americans. Casualties were uneven but symbolically significant. German artillery crews attempting last-minute demolitions suffered from misfires and artillery counter-battery fire. American forces, despite facing sporadic resistance, incurred relatively light losses due to careful coordination and effective use of cover. Engineers, often exposed directly on the bridge, worked under constant threat, yet moved with precision that minimized casualties while securing maximum strategic gain. Beyond the immediate tactical effects, the psychological consequences were profound. For German officers, the intact bridge was a visible confirmation that their defenses were failing. Morale collapsed not because of numbers alone, but because the perception of control, the belief that they could dictate the pace of retreat or delay, had evaporated. Soldiers whispered of inevitability. Some refused to engage, anticipating the end of the line. The capture of Remagen became a defining moment in the mental unraveling of Germany's Western Front. The Ludendorff Bridge, once a mere crossing over the Rhine, now dictated the tempo of the Allies' advance. American units flowed into the interior of Germany with speed previously thought impossible, exploiting every weakness revealed by the failed German defense. The stage was set for further crossings, rapid offensives, and the final unraveling of German resistance in the West. In the days following March 7, 1945, the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen reshaped the Western Front. American divisions streamed across the Rhine, establishing bridgeheads that allowed tanks, artillery, and infantry to penetrate deep into the Rhineland. The psychological shock to German forces was immediate. Commanders, once confident in their ability to hold the river as a defensive barrier, were now forced into rapid, disorganized retreats. Strategic plans meticulously crafted to delay the Allies were rendered obsolete almost overnight. German officers' reflections, preserved in post-war memoirs and reports, reveal the depth of their despair. Many described the moment the American flag rose atop the bridge as a confirmation of inevitable defeat. Oberstleutnant Hans Scheller, captured later that month, recounted the overwhelming sense of helplessness. "We knew the Rhine could no longer hold. The war was no longer in our hands." Across the command chain, officers grappled with the collapse of morale, the loss of territory, and the realization that the Third Reich's final defenses were crumbling. Strategically, the intact bridge accelerated the Allied advance into Germany by weeks. Cities such as Bonn, Cologne, and Düsseldorf faced imminent occupation, and German units found themselves unable to regroup or mount effective counterattacks. Engineers who had worked tirelessly to destroy crossings were left demoralized. Their failure underscored the growing disparity between American operational efficiency and German exhaustion. Reports from the U.S. First Army noted that the speed of the advance exceeded initial estimates, demonstrating the bridge's outsized impact on operational momentum. The capture of Remagen also had broader symbolic significance. For the Allies, it became a celebrated feat of coordination, courage, and engineering. For German forces, it marked the tangible loss of control over the Rhine, a river long thought impregnable. Morale on both sides reflected this. American soldiers were emboldened, confident in the impending collapse of Nazi Germany, while German troops increasingly viewed resistance as futile. The Ludendorff Bridge, though destroyed 10 days later due to structural collapse, had already fulfilled its strategic purpose. Its brief existence in American hands ensured that the Western Allies could bypass months of defensive preparations, striking into Germany's heartland with speed and decisiveness. The echoes of that moment, officers whispering, flags rising, and the Rhine suddenly open, would reverberate through the final weeks of the war, shaping the outcome in ways that no prior battle had. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was more than a tactical victory. It was a moment that crystallized the human, technological, and strategic dimensions of war. In a single act, soldiers crossing a fragile steel bridge, a small flag rising against smoke and mist, the fragile line between hope and despair, victory and defeat, was laid bare. German officers whispered acknowledgement. "It's all over now. became a symbol not only of the collapse of a defense but of the inevitable unraveling of a nation at war. This moment demonstrated how leadership, preparation, and adaptability could overcome formidable obstacles. American commanders had exploited speed, intelligence, and engineering skill to transform a narrow crossing into a decisive advantage. The interplay between human courage and technological execution highlighted the complexity of modern warfare. Success required both planning and the willingness to act under uncertainty. Yet the Remagen crossing also reflected the human cost and fragility of morale. On the German side, months of retreat, exhaustion, and fractured command structures converged at the bridge. Officers and soldiers alike faced the unbearable reality that all their calculations, efforts, and sacrifices could not halt the momentum of a determined and well-coordinated opponent. The psychological dimension, despair, resignation, and fleeting hope, proved as decisive as any weapon or strategy. Historically, the events at Remagen accelerated the end of the Third Reich. By providing the Allies an intact crossing, it opened the Rhine to rapid occupation, shortening the war and forcing German forces into a defensive spiral from which they could not recover. The bridge, though short-lived in physical terms, became a symbol of the turning tide on the Western Front. In the quiet after the storm, one can imagine the river flowing as it had for centuries, indifferent to the flags, the explosions, and the human drama played upon its banks. Yet in those hours it witnessed the convergence of strategy, human endurance, and fate. Remagen reminds us that history is shaped not only by armies and maps but by moments of clarity, courage, and inevitability, where the rise of a flag signals not just conquest, but the unfolding of history itself.